Hello everyone. In the previous lecture, we saw the factors responsible for the origin and development of nation. The three factors that we saw in this context were enlightenment, revolution, and the print capitalism. We saw that while enlightenment ideals challenged the divine right of the kings to rule and intellectually empowered the common populace to aspire for a form of governance based on the will of the people, the revolution put those ideas into practice. The print capitalism instilled in people a shared sense of commonality by creating common events in the lives of people. In this lecture, we will primarily explore the route through which the ideas of nation, nationalism, and modernity reached the colonies. We have seen that the concept of nation was rooted in progressive ideas such as equality, democracy, individual rights, and popular sovereignty. However, while these principles were strongly upheld within Europe, they were largely disregarded in the context of the colonies. During this time, Europe was also undergoing the Industrial Revolution, which created an urgent need for raw materials to sustain its industries. To fulfill this increasing demand for raw materials, European powers turned to the Afro-Asian world. They set up colonies in the rest of the world to meet their need for raw materials. They extracted resources such as cotton, rubber, coal, and minerals from Asia, Africa, and the Americas to fuel their industries. Additionally, they also established markets in the colonies to sell their manufactured goods, further integrating colonial economies into the system that primarily benefited Europe. Beyond economic exploitation, colonial expansion was also driven by political competition among European powers, each seeking to strengthen its global influence. The possession of colonies was seen as a measure of a nation's strength. The rivalry between Britain, France, Germany, and other European nations fueled aggressive expansionist policies, often justified by the need to maintain a balance of power. Colonization was also seen as a matter of national pride. Having more colonies symbolized or meant prestige, superiority, and civilizational dominance. The ideology of imperialism promoted the belief that expanding territorial control was a sign of progress and national greatness. This competition reached its peak during the late 19th and early 20th century, particularly in Africa and Asia, where European powers carved up vast regions in pursuit of political and symbolic supremacy. One of the major problems that European powers faced during the time in the non-Western world was a moral dilemma. While they championed the principles of equality, liberty, and popular sovereignty within Europe, they blatantly disregarded these ideals in the colonies. To reconcile this contradiction and justify their continued presence in the non-Western world, they developed the theory of the civilizing mission. This narrative presented colonial rule as a benevolent effort to uplift and modernize the so-called backward societies. Such a strategy allowed European powers to mask the exploitative nature of their domination under the guise of moral responsibility. In order to justify their involvement in the Afro-Asian colonies and also to mask their profit-driven motives, the empire found it necessary to create a cultural distinction between the East and the West. This distinction was constructed through a deliberate and calculated set of narratives which served to rationalize foreign rule in these colonies. These narratives portrayed the East as Europe's cultural opposite. They associated qualities such as irrationality, primitivism, and exoticism with the Orient, while presenting Europe as the embodiment of rationality, modernity, and scientific temper. Edward Said coined the term Orientalism to describe the collective body of these discourses that projected the Orient as an exotic other of Europe. Edward Said, in his very famous work Orientalism, defines his concept of Orientalism as follows. According to Said, Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it by teaching it, setting it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. I have found it useful here to employ Michel Foucault's notion of a discourse, as described by him in The Archaeology of Knowledge and in Discipline and Punish, to identify Orientalism. My contention is that without examining Orientalism as a discourse, one cannot possibly understand the enormously systematic discipline by which European culture was able to manage and even produce the Orient politically, sociologically, ideologically, scientifically, and imaginatively during the post-Enlightenment period. Moreover, so authoritative a position did Orientalism have that I believe no one writing, thinking, or acting on the Orient could do so without taking account of the limitations on thought and action imposed by Orientalism. In brief, because of Orientalism, the Orient was not and is not a free subject of thought or action. The Orientalist narratives played a crucial role in presenting the Orient as a site of degeneration and cultural lack. Here, we should particularly need to note that the Orientalist narrative, although they were primarily meant for the natives in the colonies to create a cultural lack in them, significantly conditioned the Occident's, particularly the colonizers' perspective about their colonies in the Afro-Asian countries, as well as about the natives inhabiting these colonies. For many of them, the natives of the Orient were untamable beasts that had to be tamed and made fit for a civilized life. Now, you may ask, what is the form of an Orientalist discourse? Well, the Orientalist narratives did not have one specific format or pattern. They covered the entire terrain of knowledge, producing knowledge of production, and appeared in many forms, in the form of literary representations, anthropological observations, artistic representations, documentaries, and so on. An example of Orientalist narrative from literature is the poem White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling. The poem reflects the colonial mindset of the 19th and early 20th centuries vis-a-vis the Orient. The poem is in the form of an appeal to the United States to take up imperial responsibility in Philippines. It presents colonialism as a moral duty of Western nations. Kipling portrays colonized people as half devil and half child, suggesting they are incapable of self-rule and require Western intervention for their upliftment. The poem very clearly justifies imperialism as a self-sacrificial act where the colonizers endure hardship for the supposed benefit of the colonized. Another interesting example is the genre of detective fiction. Many of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's detective stories featuring Sherlock Holmes present the Orient as the despicable other of Europe. The story that immediately comes to my mind is The Adventure of the Speckled Band. The antagonist of the story, Dr. Roylott, is a person who had strong connection with the Orient. The backstory of Dr. Roylott is very interesting. Roylott's family was once among the wealthiest in England. However, over the past century, 4 successive heirs led a life of total extravagance and wastefulness, thereby causing the downfall of the family. After the extravaganza of his ancestors, all that remained were a few acres of land and a 200-year-old house. But Roylott, unlike his predecessors, was very smart, enthusiastic, and enterprising. He was determined to restore his family to its erstwhile glory and establish himself as a successful man. He secured a loan from a relative and pursued a medical degree. He then traveled to Calcutta to start off his career. His professional expertise and strong-willed nature helped him establish a thriving practice. But certain turn of events in Calcutta, that is in the Orient, ruined Dr. Roylott's life completely. One day, a series of thefts happened in his house. In a fit of rage over these thefts in his household, he fatally beat his native butler and narrowly escaped the death penalty. Instead, he served a lengthy prison sentence, after which he returned to England as a bitter and disillusioned man. Dr. Roylott, initially depicted as an ambitious and capable young man who adapts to changing economic conditions by pursuing a medical degree, experiences a dramatic transformation during his time in India. The story suggests that his violent outburst and subsequent downfall were direct consequences of his exposure to the colonial environment. His rage, which culminates in the brutal murder of his butler, reinforces a stereotype of India as a lawless, treacherous place that corrupts the moral fabric of those who engage with it. This aligns with the broader imperialist discourse that views the Orient as a space of moral ambiguity, where European rationality and civility are challenged by an alien and chaotic world. The idea that India was responsible for Roylott's degeneration echoes Kipling's White Man's Burden, which frames colonial subjects as burdensome and dangerous, necessitating control by the colonizers. The implicit warning in Doyle's narrative is that prolonged exposure to the colonies leads to a loss of discipline, reason, and even humanity, a notion that's frequently explored in Victorian literature. The story portrays colonial rule as just and fair. Though the crime was by a white man in the story, he was punished. British law upheld order, unlike the chaotic colonies. This subtly legitimized the imperial rule. It's time to wind up the class. Let's take a glance at all the major ideas that we have discussed in this lecture. The concept of nation was based on progressive ideals like democracy and equality, but these were not extended to the colonies. The Industrial Revolution created a strong demand for raw materials, leading European powers to exploit resources from Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Colonies also served as markets for European manufactured goods, integrating them into a system that primarily benefited Europe. Beyond economic motives, political competition among European nations fueled aggressive colonial expansion. The possession of colonies became a measure of national strength, symbolizing prestige and civilizational dominance. One of the main challenges European powers faced in the non-Western world was a moral contradiction. That is, while they upheld ideals of equality, liberty, and popular sovereignty in Europe, they disregarded these principles blatantly in their colonies. But to justify their continued dominance, they developed the theory of the civilizing mission. European powers justified their colonial rule by framing it as a civilizing mission, masking exploitation under the guise of moral responsibility. They constructed the East as Europe's cultural opposite, portraying it as primitive, irrational, and exotic. Edward Said termed these narratives portraying the Orient as an exotic other, Orientalism. This distinction helped rationalize foreign rule and shape both the native and the colonial perspectives. Orientalist narratives appeared in various forms, including literature and anthropology, reinforcing the idea that colonized societies were backward and in need for Western intervention. I hope you have understood all the major lessons that we discussed so far. Thank you.